So about a week ago, I released the alpha demo for the game I'm working on, and that's been going pretty good. I was able to get some more feedback off of it from that. But besides that, I haven't made a devlog in a while, and it's gonna be from me recording at different moments in time, so my voice might change a little throughout the video, and I did that just in order to try and keep my memory fresher for what I was doing at the time. Some of this stuff goes like 2 months back. So let me start explaining some of the stuff I did. So, as I mentioned during my last video, I started off this game by making it for a jam, and that jam is now finished, in which I came 5th out of 34 people. I consider that pretty good. Now, moving on, the first thing I did was music, because I wasn't sure how that would loop into the game very well. I had just done a bunch of sound stuff, so I just wanted to get to it. And after watching a couple random sound design videos, I still had no idea what I was doing. And I don't have good software for it. I ended up using BandLab just for like its keyboard, piano, and other instruments so that I could get a melody off of. And then I'd found a bunch of samples off the internet that were royalty free, which I downloaded, and then I composed it a little more sophisticatedly in Audacity and applied some effects to some stuff, blah blah blah. I found that coming from a game designer and not a music composer, I found it a lot easier to make decent music, and I was thinking of it more as from a game design perspective, such as when we make attack animations, we generally want a short wind up and then a long after effect that happens to make it feel like it hit hard. So if I wanted something to hit hard in my music, I would do short wind up and then long recoil. And this approach definitely isn't the best and requires a bit of imagination, but for my last track it ended up working pretty good, which I'll play right now. And then there were 2 other tracks I made which were pretty bad. Here's one of them. Yeah, I'll definitely be redoing that later on, but it was good enough for now. When it came to implementing it, I wanted it so that the music added in a little bit more as the boss's phase advanced, and so I made a couple loops that would slowly build up into bigger things, and they would change throughout the boss fight. It's not too complex. Then I decided that I wanted to get a rough copy of the entire game thought out, so I grabbed my notebook and pencil and I just did a ton of game design, which I can start off by explaining my design for the dungeons, which I basically made a list of what makes a dungeon good, or what have I seen make a dungeon good in the past. That's exploration choice, some sort of landmark that sets the dungeon apart and makes it feel unique, having the dungeon loop back in on itself, multiple treasure rooms for you to discover, some traps, and a big monster somewhere, normally the boss. And I was referring a lot to the Zelda dungeons, which I'm not going to explain entirely how they work, but the formula for them is pretty good. However, my game is not Zelda. It doesn't have an open world either, so I couldn't make an exact Zelda copy. So I wrote down a couple things of what I needed, which was to learn enemies, which would be similar to the boss. That way the player could get in some training before they fought the boss. And then they need to find the boss, of course. Then they can gain the power of the boss. And then I wanted them to use that power of the boss a bit afterwards while they're still in the dungeon. Maybe unlock some new rooms that they couldn't get to before. And then, if possible, to test the player's skill of that power in the next dungeon. And my formula that I ended up coming up with was basically to have a center room that there were a couple different paths you could choose to go down, and the player would learn the enemy, and then there'd be another room that could only be accessed after beating the room where they learned the enemy further down in the dungeon, where they would then master the enemy, so they'd come across them in a more difficult encounter, and then they'd find the boss, the door to the boss, and then they'd have to find a key to that door afterwards. Then I wanted some choices for the player to take, so I decided that I wanted another key that would be for a treasure room that the player could gain from doing something that was a bit more difficult in the dungeon. Not as hard as the boss, but fairly hard. Whether that's platforming or an enemy room, I don't know. But I didn't have any items I could use as treasure, and so I came up with a kinda basically charm copy from Hollow Knight, where the player could find these items that they can equip. They'd give them stat changes or a new mechanic they could try and use in boss fights. I generally wanted to make these come with a pro and a con, so they weren't straight up buffs, which then plays into the optional thing a bit more, whether you want to actually get them or not. But they were more just like a different way to play rather than a better, you're stronger at playing. And I thought that would add in to a bit more replayability as well, because the players could try out using different focuses against different bosses, and that was basically my formula. I ended up making some larger dungeons that would have a bit of puzzle elements and more objectives you'd have to go to, and more optional stuff, but the base idea was basically the same. I made a rough copy for every boss, which I ended up with like 10. There's going to be a secret boss, but I'm going to wait to design them until I've made all the other bosses. That way I know what the hardest part of my game is, and if there's anything that I haven't tested to play on yet. I also designed all the abilities, which there isn't really too much interesting going into that process. I came up with a bit more stuff for the story, which I won't talk about in this video, and that's about it for the design. I really didn't get into much, but it's basically just the same thing over and over. Next I worked on the animations for the player's new abilities that they would have, as I wanted to finish off making the player, and I added in some more effects to the abilities I had already made. I went through my game and fixed a lot of script bugs. I made ladders for the player to climb, because I'd need some sort of way for the player to traverse vertically easily in dungeons, and I also made platforms which they could jump through. Finally, I decided to start working on the first dungeon, which my process of making the platforming sections, which I'd have a test area that I could mess around with, and then I'd implement them into a bigger file in Sprite, which I would eventually draw my tile map over, as well as later the background, because I wanted to finalize what the tile map would be first, as well as the foreground. I also came up with a bunch of props, mostly lighting stuff, because that's how you make games look good. Okay, so my voice may sound a little different from here on in the video, because I'm recording this about a month later since the rest of this video, and that's because I've had a lot of stuff to do with making the first dungeon. It ended up being kind of like, it ended up having a bit of a snowball effect of all the new stuff I had to do in order to make it work. I had to make a new camera system so that the player could be followed around the dungeon. I had to make a key and door system. I had to design some new save systems that I could use throughout all the dungeons while still being efficient with my save game. I needed to make a focus menu, which is basically like a charm system from Hollow Knight, which I'm using to add in some rewards for the player exploring some of the map that they don't have to. And none of these are too game changing. There's going to be a couple that make the gameplay more interesting for sure, but most of them is just filler stuff, if I'm being honest, which I'm not too happy about, but I do want to make the levels non-linear and feel like it's not just one pathway, and this is how I do it without making it with just dead ends. Then I also had to make a whole new boss, which I could have taught some more mechanics of the game earlier on, but I thought that since the player had already been learning just a bunch of stuff, just because there's a fair amount of complexity to my game, I'd give them a break and just hand them a boss that they didn't need to learn anything new for. And then between the Javelinier and the Captain, we went from having a boss that had 1 attack to having a boss that had 3 attacks plus a 4th one that gets activated every now and then. So I wanted to have it so that we'd have a boss with 2 attacks that it alternates between, and then there's also 2 others that we'll use in special occasions. So it has still 4 different possible attacks, but with the Captain you also have to learn how armor works, so then this way it's not all on top of itself, learning new stuff and challenges. I also wanted to make some stuff that could make the game feel more immersive, so I made some scrolls which you could step on and they would scrunch down for a bit before popping back up. I made some mushrooms that would move a little when you went inside of them, as well as some that could work on walls. That would be more handy for when the player has their wall climb later on, but still serves some decoration purposes for now. And I also made lots of bugs. Because you're in such a wild environment, well, I do need some birds and beasts and stuff. Generally, bugs are kind of like things you can use basically anywhere to make it feel a little more real. I made these spiders that would just walk back and forth, and then you can kill them. I made worms that would crawl around back and forth slowly, and I also made some flies that would stay at one spot and just like buzz around in a swarm. And I have a couple different versions of these. I have a glowworm and some flies with different glowing colors as well. They're more fireflies, but I was thinking I would use those for some of the other dungeons that had a bit more magic involved with them. I had to make a bunch of new assets for making the background of this dungeon as well. I had bookshelves, crates, corpses, pillars, all just to make it feel filled in and like it was lived in. And I also ended up making a health system because I was told a lot that my initial game demo was way too hard, which I can now totally see. At the time it was just like I needed to get something done, and I had played through it so much that I had lost track of how difficult it gotten. But hopefully now with free health, it should feel more balanced. It should feel less impossible, and hopefully just kinda hard. I also need to teach players how to use some more platforming mechanics. I had some ladders and platforms that the player could pass through, and making those was actually a little complicated. Not the ladders, but the platforms you can pass through. I didn't want to do any reparenting, and I ended up making a collision layer on them that would act on the player, and a different collision layer that would act on the enemies. And then when the player would hold their down button and press space or their jump button, then they would fall through them and it would disable the collision shape. Then I'd have this area farther up of them that was about the player's height that would detect them and then make them solid again, which they would normally be non-solid by default. And I do have a bug with those where every now and then when the player presses their down button, they just won't fall down them, and they'll have to jump up and fall back down on it again, and then it'll work. And I'm trying to figure out what causes that, but I haven't been able to yet. Then after doing all of that, I had pieced together my first dungeon, which I'm glad how it turned out. I think having these definitely makes the game feel... They're definitely going to end up being the more interesting levels of the game, and hopefully stand out to the player. So then after that, I also had some in-between levels I had to make. I had to teach how the ladders work and the platforms you can pass through, which wasn't too hard. I also needed to teach how checkpoints worked earlier on in the game. Getting pretty excited because I've gotten started on some lore and I've fully designed the story, and I think it's going to turn out pretty interesting. And I also get to start working forward instead of in between with my game more, which is going to make me feel like I'm actually making progress more. Because right now it just feels like I'm filling in the gaps, but soon I'll be able to start moving the game forward more, and I'm glad for that to happen.
and that's exciting.
So then once I'd done all that, I made up a demo and released it as the new version of my game. And then I went around trying to get people to play it so that I could get as much feedback as I could. I got some stuff that was useful, and I quickly changed up that stuff a bit. And then now I'm working on new content. Like, there's still a bit of changes and things that I'll always be making to the old stuff, but I'm mostly making on new stuff, not stuff in between levels, but stuff after what I've already done. So if you're interested in my game or you enjoy these devlogs, consider subscribing if you have any questions, or if you'd like a little more details on some of the stuff I've talked about throughout this video, then just comment it below. And thank you for watching this video. I hope you have a good day.